Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. It started with a glance, a fleeting moment that might have gone unnoticed in a different time, a different life. But something about Rachel's expression that evening carved itself into my mind. Her eyes, once so warm and familiar, now seemed guarded, as though she carried a secret too heavy to share. It was a Thursday, one of those unremarkable midweek nights. I'd gotten home from work late again, the firm's endless demands keeping me tethered to my desk. Rachel was in the kitchen when I walked in, her back to me as she leaned over her phone. The soft light from the range hood spilled over her hair, catching in the golden strands that I used to run my fingers through every night. She didn't turn when the door clicked shut behind me. That was the first thing I noticed. "Hey," I said, setting my briefcase down by the couch. "Smells good in here. What's for dinner?" She startled slightly, as if she hadn't heard me come in. Turning quickly, she plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, just something simple. Pasta." Her voice was light, casual, too casual. "Pasta's always good," I said, trying to shake the unease creeping into my chest. I kissed her cheek, and she stiffened imperceptibly. Maybe I imagined it. The rest of the evening passed like so many others. We ate at the dining table, discussing the usual topics. Work, the weather, the latest drama in our neighborhood association. But Rachel's responses were clipped, her laughter forced. I'd always prided myself on reading her moods, understanding her even when she didn't have the words. But tonight she felt like a stranger. It wasn't until we were in bed, the house dark and quiet, that I finally asked, "Everything okay?" She turned to me, her face half buried in her pillow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, hesitating. "You just seem distracted lately. Busy, maybe. Stressed." Rachel's lips curved into a small smile, but it looked like an effort. "Work has been crazy. You know how it is. A new client came in last week, and it's been non-stop since then." I nodded, though her words didn't ease the tightness in my chest. "Anything I can help with?" "No, it's fine. Really." She rolled over, ending the conversation. I stared at the ceiling long after her breathing had evened out, wondering why I felt like I was losing her. The next morning, Rachel left early. She always left early these days. I caught a glimpse of her as she pulled on her coat by the front door, her phone clutched in one hand. "You're working late again?" I asked. She paused, looking over her shoulder. "Probably. Don't wait up." I watched her go, the click of her heels fading down the walkway. There was something off in the way she carried herself, a nervous energy I hadn't noticed before. I shook it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. That night, as I scrolled through the news in bed, I got a text from Rachel. "Client dinner running late. Don't wait up." It wasn't unusual. Rachel's job as a corporate attorney often demanded long hours and last-minute commitments. But tonight it felt different. I couldn't explain why. The weekend brought little relief. We went to brunch with friends, something we'd done countless times before. Rachel was charming and animated, laughing at the right moments, making all the right comments. But I could see the cracks beneath the surface. She kept glancing at her phone, a subtle but constant distraction. When I reached for her hand under the table, she let me take it but didn't squeeze back. Afterward, as we walked to the car, I asked, "Is everything okay between us?" Rachel stopped, her eyes searching mine. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know. You've been different lately. Distant, maybe." She sighed, looking away. "Michael, it's just work. Things are hectic. I'm sorry if I've seemed off. I'll try to do better." Her words were earnest, her tone apologetic, but something inside me still felt hollow. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. 2 weeks later, the real fracture appeared. Rachel had another late night at work, and I decided to surprise her by picking her up from the office. As I parked across the street, I saw her exit the building with a man I didn't recognize. He was younger than me, tall and sharp-featured, with an easy confidence that made my stomach churn. They stood close, too close, talking in low voices before Rachel laughed at something he said. It wasn't the polite, professional laugh she gave at client dinners. It was something else, something familiar. I sat frozen in the car, watching as she reached out to touch his arm. The gesture was small, fleeting, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. They walked away together, disappearing around the corner. For a long time I couldn't move. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. My mind raced with explanations, rationalizations, desperate attempts to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I thought I'd seen. But deep down I knew. Rachel wasn't mine anymore. At least not entirely. The days that followed felt like an endless haze. Every glance at Rachel carried a weight I couldn't shake, and every interaction was clouded by suspicion. I tried to push the memory of that man out of my mind, convincing myself I had misunderstood, that it was a harmless colleague. But the image of her touch lingered. It wasn't until the following Monday evening that the tension came to a head. Rachel was home for once, perched at the kitchen counter with her laptop open and a glass of wine in hand. I stood in the doorway for a moment watching her type. She looked the same as always, yet entirely different. The realization gnawed at me. The distance between us wasn't just in my head. "How was work?" I asked, stepping into the kitchen and grabbing a beer from the fridge. She barely glanced up. "Busy. Same as always." I leaned against the counter, studying her. "Anything interesting going on? Any big cases?" "Just the usual," she said with a small shrug. Her tone was dismissive, as though my questions were an inconvenience. I clenched the bottle in my hand, swallowing the frustration building inside me. "You've been working late a lot lately. Are they really keeping you that busy?" Rachel's fingers paused over the keyboard. Slowly, she looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "What are you trying to say, Michael?" "I'm just asking," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "It feels like you're not around much anymore." She sighed, setting her wine glass down with more force than necessary. "We've been over this. I told you work has been crazy. Do you think I enjoy being gone all the time?" "I don't know," I said before I could stop myself. "Do you?" Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flash of the Rachel I used to know, the one who wouldn't back down from a fight. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I muttered, shaking my head. "Forget it." But the words were already out there, hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. Rachel stared at me for a moment longer before turning back to her laptop. "I don't have time for this," she said, her voice icy. I left the kitchen, my chest tight with unspoken words. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the framed photos on the dresser. There we were, smiling on our wedding day, laughing on a trip to the Grand Canyon, clinking glasses at some long-forgotten party. Each image felt like a relic from another life, a life I wasn't sure we still shared. The tension between us didn't ease in the days that followed. If anything, it grew worse. Rachel's late nights continued, and when she was home, her focus was always elsewhere. I found myself analyzing every word she said, every look she gave me, searching for clues to explain the growing chasm between us. One evening, I decided to confront her again. It was late, and I'd been sitting in the living room, nursing a second whiskey as I waited for her to come home. When the door finally opened, Rachel stepped inside, her coat draped over one arm and her phone clutched tightly in the other. She froze when she saw me. "You're up late," she said, her tone guarded. "So are you," I replied. My voice was calm, but inside I was boiling. "Who were you with?" Her eyes widened just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "What?" she said, laughing nervously. "I told you I was working late." "Working with who?" I pressed, standing now. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. "The same guy I saw you with outside your office last week?" Her expression shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Anger? Fear? Guilt? "You were spying on me?" "I wasn't spying," I said, my voice rising. "I came to pick you up and I saw you with him. You looked—" I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. "Looked like what?" she snapped, dropping her coat onto the arm of the couch. "Like I was talking to a coworker? Is that a crime now?" "It wasn't just talking, Rachel," I said, my hands balling into fists. You touched his arm. You laughed with him. It wasn't professional, and you know it. This is insane, she said, turning away from me. You're making something out of nothing. Am I? I shot back. Because it doesn't feel like nothing. It feels like you're hiding something from me. She spun around, her eyes blazing. You're paranoid, Michael. This is why I've been distant. I can't even breathe without you accusing me of something. The words hit like a slap. I stared at her, my heart pounding. So it's my fault now? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. Maybe it is. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us deafening. Then she grabbed her phone and walked past me, heading upstairs without another word. The sound of the bedroom door closing echoed through the house. I sank back onto the couch, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was paranoid. Or maybe I wasn't. Either way, the distance between us felt insurmountable. A chasm I didn't know how to cross. In the days following our confrontation, Rachel and I fell into a strange rhythm. The tension between us remained unspoken but palpable, an invisible wall dividing our lives. We continued our routines. Dinners together, polite conversations, shared spaces, but everything felt forced, like an uneasy truce. Beneath the surface, I couldn't stop analyzing her every move, every glance, every word. One evening, as I sat in the living room flipping through channels, Rachel came home earlier than expected. She walked in with her coat draped over her arm, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and for a moment, the sight of her took me back to the early days of our marriage. There was a time when seeing her like that, vibrant, alive, would have filled me with warmth. Now it only reminded me of how much I'd lost. You're home early, I said, my voice betraying my surprise. She nodded, setting her bag down on the entry table. Yeah, the meeting wrapped up sooner than I thought. That's good, I replied, trying to sound casual. Dinner's in the oven. Thanks, she said, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in her expression, a flicker of hesitation, maybe guilt, couldn't tell. As she walked past me toward the kitchen, her hand brushed against my shoulder. It was the lightest of touches, barely more than a graze, but it sent a jolt through me. My mind immediately jumped to the memory of her touching that man's arm outside her office. The comparison was involuntary, a reflex I couldn't control. I turned to look at her, but she was already pulling plates from the cabinet, her movements quick and efficient. Did she feel it too? Or was it nothing to her? Just an accident? Over the next few days, the accidental touches continued. Small, fleeting moments that I might have ignored before now seemed magnified. Her hand brushing mine as she passed the salt at dinner. Her knee grazing mine when we sat together on the couch. A brief, almost imperceptible squeeze of my arm when I helped her carry groceries in from the car. Each touch felt charged, sparking a mixture of emotions I couldn't untangle. Was it an attempt at reconciliation? A way to bridge the gap between us? Or was it simply habit, muscle memory from a time when touching me was second nature to her? One night, as we stood side by side in the bathroom brushing our teeth, our shoulders bumped. She laughed softly, a sound that was both familiar and foreign. Sorry, she said, glancing at me in the mirror. It's okay, I replied, meeting her eyes. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease, the air between us lighter. But just as quickly as it came, the moment passed. She looked away, rinsing her toothbrush and leaving the room without another word. The uncertainty was maddening. Each touch, each glance, each shared moment felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. I found myself questioning everything. Was I reading too much into it? Was this her way of trying to repair what was broken? Or was it all in my head? A desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone? One afternoon, I decided to test the waters. Rachel was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I walked up behind her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, and placed a hand on her lower back. She froze for a fraction of a second before continuing to chop. Do you need something? She asked, her tone neutral. Just wanted to see if you needed help, I said, leaving my hand where it was. I've got it, she replied, glancing at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were guarded, her smile tight. I stepped back, the rejection subtle but unmistakable. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the moment in my head. The way she stiffened under my touch. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. Something I couldn't hold on to no matter how hard I tried. But then there were the other moments. The accidental touches, the fleeting glances, the small laughs. They felt real, genuine, like glimpses of the woman I fell in love with. Were they signs of hope? Or just echoes of a love that was already fading? I didn't know. And the not knowing was tearing me apart. The tension between Rachel and me had reached a breaking point. We existed in the same house, but it felt more like two strangers sharing a space than the life we had built together. I tried to bridge the gap, to recapture even a fragment of what we once had, but the more I reached out, the more she seemed to slip away. Then, one Friday evening, she came home with an unexpected proposition. "Do you want to go out tomorrow night?" Rachel asked as she shrugged off her coat. Her voice was casual, almost tentative. I blinked, caught off guard. "Out? Like a date?" She nodded, setting her bag down on the table. "Yeah, just the two of us. We haven't done that in a while." It was true. The last time we'd gone out together without an obligation or a group of friends felt like a lifetime ago. I wanted to ask why now, what had changed. But instead, I just said, "Sure, I'd like that." The next evening, I found myself waiting at the bottom of the stairs, adjusting the collar of my shirt for the third time. I hadn't been this nervous since our first few dates years ago. When Rachel finally appeared, descending the staircase in a sleek black dress, I couldn't help but stare. She looked beautiful, but there was something guarded in her expression, like she was bracing herself. "You look amazing," I said, my voice catching slightly. She smiled faintly, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." The compliment felt hollow, but I held on to it, hoping tonight might be the start of something better. We went to a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent in the early years of our marriage. It was a place filled with memories. Our first anniversary, countless celebrations, lazy Sunday dinners when neither of us felt like cooking. Walking through the door felt like stepping back in time, but the weight of the present clung to us. The hostess seated us at a corner table by the window. Candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows across Rachel's face. She glanced at the menu, her fingers tracing the edge absently. "I'll probably get the ravioli," she said. "I always loved their ravioli." "You should," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's your favorite." She nodded, but her gaze drifted past me, out the window to the street beyond. My stomach tightened. Was she really here with me? Or was her mind somewhere else? When the waiter came, we placed our orders and settled into an awkward silence. I sipped my wine, watching her as she stared down at her glass, turning it slowly in her hands. "Rachel," I said finally, breaking the quiet, "what made you want to do this?" She looked up, startled by the directness of my question. "What do you mean? This? Going out tonight?" I gestured to the table. "It's been a while since you've seemed interested in doing something like this." Her lips parted as if to respond, but then she hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know," she said finally. "I just thought it might be nice to reconnect." "Reconnecting sounds good," I said, though the words felt fragile. "I've missed this. I've missed us." Her gaze dropped again, and she took a sip of her wine. "Me too." The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit me like a wave. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. Maybe tonight could be the start of something new. The food arrived, and we talked. Tentative, careful conversations that felt like we were testing the waters. She told me about her latest case at work, and I shared a funny story about a coworker. For a while, it almost felt normal. Almost. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't ignore the moments when her smile faded too quickly, or the way her eyes darted to her phone every time it buzzed. She didn't check it, but the mere presence of it on the table felt like a barrier between us. When dessert came, I decided to confront it head-on. "Rachel, is everything okay?" She froze, her fork hovering over the tiramisu. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It feels like you're here, but not really here. Like there's something on your mind." She set the fork down, her expression guarded again. "Michael, she trailed off, looking away. "It's just work. Things have been stressful lately. I'm sorry if I've seemed distracted." "It's more than that," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I can feel it. Please just talk to me. Whatever it is, we can figure it out." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought she might finally open up. But then she shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "You're overthinking things, Michael. Let's just enjoy tonight. Okay?" I nodded, though her words felt like a dismissal. We finished dessert in silence, the hopeful spark I'd felt earlier dimming with each passing moment. When we got home, Rachel went straight upstairs, claiming she was tired. I stayed in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass she'd left on the table. Tonight was supposed to be a step forward, but instead, it felt like we'd taken 2 steps back. As I sat there, the flicker of hope I'd clung to all evening began to waver. I wanted to believe her, to trust that this was just a rough patch we could overcome. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind, whispering that something was still very, very wrong. The days following our strained attempt at a date passed in a blur of routine. Rachel and I had fallen back into our pattern of avoidance. Polite exchanges over coffee, fleeting touches that lacked warmth, and nights spent on opposite sides of the bed. Each moment felt like a reminder of how far we drifted apart. Then, one night, something shifted. It was late. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the blank television screen, lost in thought. Rachel had gone to bed hours ago, or so I thought. "Michael!" Her voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, wearing one of my old t-shirts that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was unkempt, her face bare of makeup. She looked vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Hey," I said, setting my glass down. "I thought you were asleep." She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. Her eyes darted to the empty glass in front of me. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know. Are you?" Rachel let out a small, bitter laugh as she sat down on the couch beside me. "I don't know either." We sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between us filling the room. Then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out and placed her hand on mine. The touch was hesitant, as if she was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. "I miss us," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss how things used to be." Her words hit me like a wave, stirring something deep inside me that I'd been trying to bury. I turned to her, searching her face for answers. "Then why does it feel like you're pushing me away?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if we can fix this." I reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "We won't know unless we try." For a moment, she just looked at me, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. Then, slowly, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if we were testing the waters, but it quickly deepened. Years of frustration and longing spilled out in that moment, the barriers we'd built crumbling away. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I responded in kind, wrapping my arms around her and holding her like I was afraid she might disappear. The kiss grew more urgent, more desperate, as if we were trying to reclaim everything we'd lost in one single act. "Michael," she murmured against my lips, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For everything. We'll figure it out," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We have to." She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside fading away. For that brief moment, it felt like we were finally on the same page, like we could find our way back to each other. But even as we made our way upstairs, her hand clasped tightly in mine. A small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. It was too easy, too sudden. The walls we'd built couldn't come down so quickly, not without leaving cracks behind. Still, I pushed the thought aside, choosing instead to focus on the warmth of her body against mine and the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could start over. The next morning, I woke to find Rachel already out of bed. The space beside me was cold, the sheets neatly smoothed over. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire night. But then I caught the faint scent of her perfume on my pillow and knew it had been real. Downstairs, I found her in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked up when I entered, her expression unreadable. "Morning," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Morning," she replied. Her voice was neutral, almost guarded. The warmth of the previous night felt like a distant memory. As I watched her stir sugar into her coffee, the small voice in the back of my mind returned, louder this time. Last night had been a step forward, but it wasn't the solution. Whatever had driven us apart still lingered, waiting to resurface. And I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still holding something back. After the fragile intimacy of that night, I had hoped things might change between Rachel and me. For a while, it seemed like they had. The small, guarded smiles returned, and her touches became more deliberate. A hand resting on my arm as we passed in the kitchen, her fingers brushing against mine when she handed me a mug. It felt like we were rebuilding something, brick by careful brick. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show again. Rachel's late nights at the office resumed, and though she offered explanations, they always felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced them on her drive home. "The new client is demanding," she'd say. "I can't let the junior associates handle this one." I wanted to believe her, but the flicker of doubt in my chest had grown into a steady flame. It was on a Tuesday evening, after another one of her late arrivals, that I decided to push the issue. "How was work?" I asked as she shrugged off her coat and dropped her bag by the door. She glanced at me, her smile faint. "Exhausting. The client keeps changing their demands. I swear, some people thrive on chaos." "Sounds frustrating," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Who are you working with on this?" Her hand froze on the zipper of her bag for just a moment before she replied. "Mostly just me and Greg. You remember Greg, right? He's been with the firm for years." I nodded, though the name meant little to me. Rachel's colleagues had always been a blurry collection of faces and names that rarely crossed into our personal lives. "Must be nice to have someone reliable to lean on." Her smile tightened. "Yeah, it is." She turned and headed for the kitchen, effectively ending the conversation. But the unease in my chest only grew. That weekend, I decided to surprise her at work. It wasn't something I'd done before, but I convinced myself it was a gesture of support, a way to show her I cared. Deep down, though, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see for myself. I arrived at her office just before lunchtime, carrying a bag of takeout from her favorite Thai place. The receptionist recognized me and buzzed me through with a smile. "She's in her office," she said. As I walked down the hallway, my heart pounded in my chest. When I reached Rachel's door, I paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," her voice called, slightly muffled. I pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting at her desk, papers spread out in front of her. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Michael," she said, standing. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you might like some lunch," I said, holding up the bag. Her smile was strained. "That's sweet. But you didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," I replied, stepping into the room. My eyes flicked to the side table where 2 coffee cups sat, one of them still steaming. "I figured you could use a break." Rachel's gaze followed mine, and she quickly moved to tidy the table, stacking the cups and papers. "I've already eaten, actually," Greg and I grabbed something earlier while we were going over the contract drafts. Greg, I repeated, the name heavy on my tongue. You seem to be spending a lot of time with him. She froze for just a moment before meeting my eyes. He's a colleague, Michael. That's all. I never said he wasn't, I said, my voice calm but laced with something harder. Is there anything you want to tell me, Rachel? Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might confess something. But then her expression softened, her shoulders slumping slightly. Michael, you're overthinking this. I'm just trying to do my job. Can't we trust each other? The question hung in the air between us, cutting deeper than I expected. I want to trust you, I said finally, but it feels like you're keeping something from me. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm not. I promise you, there's nothing going on. Her words sounded convincing, but the doubt inside me refused to quiet. I nodded, forcing a smile. Okay, I'll take your word for it. The tension lingered as I left her office, the takeout bag still in my hand. As I walked back to the car, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with every step. That night, Rachel came home late again. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read, when she walked in. She smiled at me, a weary but genuine smile, and for a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. As she leaned down to kiss my cheek, her phone buzzed in her bag. She froze, glancing at it before straightening up. I'll be right back, she said, heading to the kitchen. I watched her go, my chest tight with suspicion. The buzz of her phone still echoed in my ears, louder than it should have been. Whatever she was hiding, I was determined to find out. The unease that had taken root in my chest now grew into a gnawing certainty. Rachel's behavior was too calculated, her movements too rehearsed. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the stress of work and our strained relationship was clouding my judgment. But the evidence was piling up, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Then came the night everything unraveled. It started innocuously enough. Rachel was preparing for yet another late evening at the office. She moved around the bedroom with practiced ease, slipping into a tailored blouse and fastening her necklace in front of the mirror. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her. Big night? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She glanced at me through the mirror, her smile tight. The client wants a final review before the presentation tomorrow. It'll probably run late. Do you want me to pick you up? I offered. It's no trouble. No, that's okay, she said quickly, almost too quickly. Greg will drop me off. He's heading in the same direction. There it was again, Greg. His name had become a constant presence in her explanations, a shadow that loomed over every excuse. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to nod. All right, be safe. She kissed my cheek, the gesture perfunctory, before grabbing her bag and heading out the door. As I watched her car disappear down the street, a decision crystallized in my mind. Tonight I would find out the truth. I waited an hour before leaving the house, giving her enough time to settle into whatever plans she truly had. The drive to her office was uneventful, my hands gripping the steering wheel as my mind raced with possibilities. When I arrived, I parked across the street and turned off the engine, watching the building from the shadows. Sure enough, Rachel's car was there, parked neatly in the lot. But something was off. The lights in her office were dark, and the rest of the building seemed deserted. I waited, my heart pounding, until I saw movement at the far end of the lot. There she was, stepping out of the side entrance with Greg beside her. They were laughing, their voices low but intimate. He opened the door of his sleek black car, and she slid inside without hesitation. The ease of their interaction made my stomach churn. I followed them, keeping a safe distance as Greg's car wound through the city streets. They eventually pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel, the kind with discreet entrances and curtain windows. My chest tightened as they walked inside together, their bodies close but not quite touching. For a moment, I sat frozen in the car, my mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. Then, without thinking, I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the small pocket knife I kept there. The weight of it in my hand was both comforting and terrifying. I didn't have a plan, only a storm of emotions that demanded an outlet. Inside the hotel, I moved quickly but quietly, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The front desk clerk barely glanced at me as I strode past, my focus laser-sharp. I didn't know what I was going to do when I found them, but the thought of confronting Rachel, of forcing her to explain herself, drove me forward. On the second floor, I spotted them at the end of the hallway. Greg opened a door, and Rachel stepped inside, her laughter echoing softly before the door clicked shut. I stood there, my hand gripping the knife in my pocket, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Images flashed through my mind. Her smile, her touch, her whispered promises. All of it felt like a cruel joke now, a carefully constructed lie. The anger surged, blinding and all-consuming, as I took a step forward. Then I heard it. A child's laugh, faint and muffled, coming from one of the nearby rooms. The sound cut through my rage like a blade, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. My hand loosened around the knife, and I blinked, my vision clearing. What was I doing? How had I let it come to this? I stumbled back, retreating down the hallway as my pulse thundered in my ears. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling. I dropped the knife onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't confront Rachel that night. When she came home hours later, her makeup slightly smudged and her hair out of place, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face her, not yet. The image of her walking into that hotel with Greg haunted me, but so did the memory of that child's laugh. Something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between suspicion and denial. But I also couldn't deny the truth any longer. Rachel was hiding something, and it was tearing us both apart. The days after the hotel incident passed in a fog of tension and suppressed emotions. Rachel carried on as though nothing had happened, her excuses and smiles just as polished as ever. But for me, the weight of what I'd seen, what I knew, was inescapable. Every word she spoke felt like a lie, every touch a betrayal. I could barely look at her without my stomach twisting. I needed answers. Late one night, while Rachel was asleep, I finally acted. Her phone was on the nightstand, its screen dark but charged with possibilities. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my hands trembling. I knew this was a line I couldn't uncross, but the thought of continuing in ignorance was unbearable. The screen lit up as I entered the passcode. Her birthday, a detail I hadn't forgotten despite everything. The phone unlocked, revealing her messages, emails, and call logs. For a moment, I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I opened her messages and began scrolling. At first, it was mundane, conversations with colleagues, updates from friends, reminders from her family. But then I saw his name, Greg. The thread was long, spanning weeks, and as I read through it, the truth unraveled before me. Their messages were playful, intimate, filled with inside jokes and plans that went far beyond work. They had met at the hotel multiple times, each encounter cloaked in careful secrecy. My chest tightened as I read her words of affection, longing, and excitement. Words she hadn't spoken to me in years. The final message was from earlier that day. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Usual place? I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. There it was, undeniable and inescapable. Rachel wasn't just distracted or overworked. She was in love with someone else. The next morning, I confronted her. I couldn't wait, couldn't hold it in any longer. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, when I walked in. My chest felt tight, my hands clenched at my sides. "We need to talk," I said, my voice strained. She looked up, startled by my tone. "What is it?" I held up her phone, the screen still open to her messages with Greg. Her face paled, the blood draining from her cheeks as she realized what I'd done. "Michael, she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't lie to me. I read everything, Rachel. I know." She froze, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, the air between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. "How long?" I demanded. "How long has this been going on?" She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Michael. I never meant for this." "But it did," I said, cutting her off again. "You made a choice, Rachel. Every text, every meeting, every lie, those were choices you made." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't find it in myself to care. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me," I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed us." She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Please, Michael, let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been sneaking around with Greg while I've been sitting here, trying to hold us together?" Her tears spilled over, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Instead, I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process everything. "Why, Rachel? Why him?" She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know," she said finally. "It just happened. I was feeling lost, disconnected, and he was there. He made me feel seen, Michael." The words cut deeper than I expected. I turned back to her, my voice cold. "Seen? You think I didn't see you? I've been here, Rachel. I've been trying. But you didn't give me a chance, did you?" She didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. That night, I slept in the guest room. The house felt colder, emptier, as though the walls themselves were bearing witness to our unraveling. I couldn't stop replaying our conversation, her words echoing in my mind. He made me feel seen. For the first time, I realized just how far apart we drifted, and how much of it was beyond repair. The silence in our home was suffocating in the days that followed my confrontation with Rachel. Every shared glance, every step we took around each other, felt loaded with unspoken words. I had thought I was prepared for the fallout, but nothing could have readied me for the ache of living in the ruins of our life together. Rachel tried to make amends in her way. She cooked dinner, left notes on the counter wishing me a good day, and even suggested we see a therapist. But every effort she made felt hollow, a futile attempt to plaster over a shattered foundation. I couldn't forget what I'd seen or erase the words she'd said, and I couldn't forgive her, not yet. It was during one of these uneasy nights that the real fracture occurred. I had retreated to the guest room again, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, when I heard her voice. At first, I thought she was speaking to me, but when I strained to listen, I realized she was on the phone. The walls were thin, and her words filtered through clearly. "I don't know what to do, Greg," she whispered. "He's so distant. It's like he's not even trying anymore." My stomach clenched at the sound of his name. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every muscle in my body tense. "I know," she continued. "I can't just leave him, not like this. It would destroy him." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Destroy me? As if she hadn't already. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. Her voice cut off abruptly as I appeared in the doorway of our bedroom. She looked up from the bed, her phone still clutched in her hand. The guilt on her face was unmistakable. "Talking to Greg again?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She set the phone down slowly, as though the act might somehow erase what I'd heard. "Michael, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I said, stepping into the room. "Then what is it, Rachel? Enlighten me, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're still running to him for everything you don't get from me." Her face crumpled, tears brimming in her eyes. "That's not fair," she said. "I'm trying, Michael. I'm trying to fix this." "By talking to the man you cheated on me with?" I shot back. "Real convincing, Rachel." She stood, crossing the room toward me. "It's not like that. I needed someone to talk to." "And you chose him?" I said, incredulous. Out of everyone in the world, you chose Greg? Her silence was answer enough. The argument that followed was a storm of shouted accusations and bitter retorts. Years of resentment and unspoken grievances spilled out, every word cutting deeper than the last. By the end of it, we were both exhausted, standing on opposite sides of the room like opposing forces in a war neither of us could win. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that we can fix this." Her shoulders sagged, her tears falling freely now. "So that's it? You're giving up on us?" "You gave up on us first," I said, the bitterness in my voice barely concealed. "The moment you let him into our lives, you made this choice. Not me." She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands covering her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. The weight of her betrayal was too much to bear. The next morning, Rachel packed a bag and left. She said she needed space to think, to figure out what she really wanted. I didn't stop her. Part of me wanted her to stay, to fight for what we had left. But a larger part of me knew it was futile. The damage was done. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost, surrounded by the remnants of our life together. Her absence was a hollow ache, but it was also a relief. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, the silence less oppressive. But as I stood in the empty bedroom, staring at the indent her body had left on the mattress, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The beginning of an end I hadn't seen coming but could no longer avoid. The weeks following Rachel's departure were a whirlwind of paperwork, tense conversations, and emotional exhaustion. Our marriage, once the foundation of my life, was now reduced to a series of legal documents and contested assets. Each meeting with the divorce attorney felt like a fresh wound, reopening the scars I'd worked so hard to ignore. Rachel and I communicated only when necessary. Most of our conversations took place through our lawyers, terse and clinical exchanges that stripped away any semblance of the love we once shared. When we did speak directly, it was strained, as though we were strangers trying to negotiate terms rather than two people who had once promised to spend their lives together. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, a sterile setting for the dissection of our lives. Rachel sat at one table, her lawyer beside her, while I sat at another with mine. She looked composed, her hair neatly styled, her expression calm. But I could see the cracks beneath her polished exterior, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. The judge began the proceedings, listing out the assets to be divided. The house, the cars, the savings account. Each item felt like a piece of our history being auctioned off, its significance reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, drawing my attention. "You're contesting the spousal support request?" I nodded, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Yes, Your Honor. Rachel's income exceeds mine. She's more than capable of supporting herself." Rachel's lawyer interjected, presenting arguments about the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to during our marriage. It was infuriating, listening to someone frame our years together as a transaction rather than a partnership. I bit my tongue, knowing that losing my temper would only hurt my case. When Rachel took the stand, her testimony was measured and careful. She spoke about our marriage, acknowledging its good moments but focusing on the breakdown, the emotional distance that had grown between us. She avoided mentioning Greg directly, a calculated move that both angered and relieved me. "I never wanted this to happen," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "But sometimes, things fall apart, and there's no way to put them back together." Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were delivered with such finality. I wanted to shout, to remind her that it hadn't just fallen apart. She had broken it. But I stayed silent, letting my lawyer handle the rebuttal. When it was my turn to speak, I struggled to find the right words. I spoke about the life we'd built, the promises we'd made, and the betrayal that had shattered it all. I didn't try to paint myself as a saint. I acknowledged my mistakes, my shortcomings. But I made it clear that Rachel's choices had been the tipping point. The final ruling came weeks later. The judge granted us joint ownership of the house, though I had no intention of staying there. Rachel was ordered to pay me a modest settlement, far less than what I'd hoped for but enough to start over. The divorce was finalized with a few strokes of a pen, the official end to a chapter one never thought would close. After the proceedings, Rachel and I stood outside the courthouse, the autumn wind biting at our faces. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between us. "So, this is it," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," I replied, shoving my hands into my pockets. "This is it." She looked down, her expression conflicted. "I'm sorry, Michael, for everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. No apology that could undo the damage. Rachel turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a long time watching her go, until the cold finally drove me to my car. As I sat behind the wheel, staring at the empty passenger seat, I felt an odd mixture of grief and relief. The life I'd known was over, but for the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could start again. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.